Welcome everyone to another edition of the Classic Comic Archive, a series where I recap and review many of Marvel Comics' most seminal early issues. Our story for today is Tales to Astonish 42, cover dated April of 1963. This issue marks the first appearance of obscure villain Jason Cragg, the voice of Doom. The issue was written by Stan Lee and Larry Lieber, drawn by Don Heck, and lettered by Art Simic. Our issue opens up with a striking splash page, teasing Ant-Man's coming battle with the wicked voice of Doom. But before we can witness such an epic showdown, we must first travel to the streets of Central City, where a strangely dressed man is preparing to give an impromptu speech. While a crowd of pedestrians indeed stops to listen to him, they all think that he's a nutty crackpot, and are just there to mock him. But as soon as he begins speaking, they all find themselves suddenly enthralled by his commanding voice. Somehow they've entered a hypnotic trance, and are now his unwitting servants. The only person unaffected is Ant-Man, as even though he happened to be passing by, his cybernetic helmet has filtered out the hypnotic element of the man's voice. But this makes him a target, so the man then convinces the crowd that Ant-Man's a villain, and that they must destroy him. But before we go any further, let's shift back several weeks into a radio recording booth, where sitting inside is a man named Jason Cragg. He's a rather mediocre announcer, and is on the cusp of being fired, as he just doesn't have enough charisma and presence to hold an audience. But one day, a nearby atomic research laboratory accidentally begins seeping radiation into the surrounding environment. While its scientists manage to contain the leak and avoid an ecological disaster, a tiny amount of radiation ends up inside Cragg's microphone. Thus, in a strange twist of fate, his vocal cords mutated, and his voice became hypnotic. At first, he didn't even realize that anything had happened. But after he advertised a brand of dog food, and people without dogs began buying it, he realized that he'd been gifted an incredible power. So he quit his announcing job, and began traveling around the country. But he wasn't a vagrant, as he simply convinced others to provide him with expensive food and lodging wherever he went. Along the way he took on the appearance of a flamboyant orator, and began searching for someone to challenge his power. Thus he's finally found such a person in Ant-Man, and wanting to prove that he's unbeatable, has vowed to destroy him. With that, the issue shifts back to the present, as Ant-Man is receiving a certificate from the police, in recognition of all that he's done to keep the city safe. But Cragg cannot stand for this apparent discretion, and declares that Ant-Man is a dangerous villain, who must be arrested immediately. The police are helpless to resist this command, and thus begin scrambling to apprehend the hero. But Ant-Man narrowly escapes them by springing off of his certificate's rubber band, and into the street. From there he hitches a ride on the shoe of a passerby, and manages to lose himself in a bustling crowd. But Cragg's determined to defeat him, and thus orders a horde of streetgoers to begin searching every corner of the city for the tiny hero. Meanwhile, Ant-Man's heading for his laboratory, where he can enlarge himself and shed his costume. Then, as Dr. Hank Pym, he can begin searching for a way to neutralize Cragg's voice. But it doesn't seem that he'll get the chance, as before he can reach his lab, the villain's mob begins combing through the park that he's hiding in. But they're not just using rakes or scythes in their search, they're using magnets affixed to the ends of poles. Thus they've constructed makeshift metal detectors, and are hoping to pick up Ant-Man's cybernetic helmet. Realizing this, the tiny hero has no choice but to abandon both his helmet and his gas canisters, although these are luckily empty. Regardless, it only takes a few more seconds before one of Cragg's minions finds them in the grass. Thus the villain realizes that Ant-Man is now vulnerable to his power, and thus commands him to surrender. And while the hero plugs his ears and resists for as long as he can, he's eventually overcome by Cragg's voice, and finally reveals himself. Thus it seems that he's met his match, as Cragg next orders him to walk to a nearby pier, and then drown himself in its waters. So Ant-Man obeys the command, and while defying his most basic instinct to survive, jumps off the pier, and allows himself to sink deep into the water. But the hero's in luck, for a group of nearby ants quickly rush to his aid, and forcibly drag him onto a floating log. The loyal insects then take him into the sewers, where his trance finally wears off. So he returns to his laboratory, and over the next few days, discovers a method to defeat Cragg. But he'll have to wait for the right moment to strike, so in the meantime, he decides to relax and watch an episode of a popular talk show. But he's just in luck, as it's announced that Cragg will be making an appearance on the show the next day. Realizing that it's his chance to defeat the villain, Pym rushes out of his lab and puts his plan in motion. He first travels to a city hospital, and as Ant-Man, steals a bottle filled with germs. He then takes this bottle to the studio that the show's filmed at, but we don't actually see what he does with the germs. Instead, the issue shifts forward to the next day, as Krag's arrived on set, and is preparing to turn the entire country against Ant-Man. But as he steps up to the microphone for his big speech, he fails to notice that the tiny hero has crawled onto his shoulder. Thus, as he's about to begin, Ant-Man whispers into his ear, and reveals that there's a concealed revolver aimed at him. Of course the weapon's only a prop, but Krag doesn't know that. So Ant-Man orders the villain to take back his slander, or else he'll have his ants fire the revolver. Thus, with seemingly no other choice, Krag capitulates, and tells the audience that he'd misjudged Ant-Man, who's actually an honest, law-abiding citizen. Satisfied with this, the hero then reveals that the revolver isn't actually loaded, and is only a prop. Yet Krag doesn't appreciate being tricked, and thus immediately goes to recount his endorsement. But something's wrong, as he can tell that his voice has changed. As it turns out, Ant-Man had coated his microphone with the germs from earlier. Thus he's caught a case of laryngitis, and has lost his hypnotic power. So the issue subsequently ends as the audience snaps out of their trance, immediately turns on Krag, and swiftly runs him out of town. That concludes the Ant-Man story in Tales to Astonish 42, and another episode of the Classic Comic Archive. But as always, I would like to offer a brief review of this issue. Overall, I thought that this was a solid, and surprisingly fun story. Going into this, I honestly didn't expect much from the issue, but ultimately found it to be a rather quick and pleasant read. It didn't feature the most compelling villain or plot, but it still worked as a simple, straightforward Ant-Man story. But in any case, let me know what you thought of this issue and the video, and feel free to suggest other classic comics for me to cover. Thanks for watching.